back to Videos from the Ville. This is Professor Greenawalt, and this is Public Administration or Government 241. We want to move next to an examination of public personnel administration, what is sometimes called today human relations. Let's take a look at public personnel. We want to start out by taking a look at the different public personnel systems that are found in the public sector. Number one would be political appointees. We have political appointees. These are appointed, of course, at the federal level by the president. All the secretaries to the various departments, assistant and deputy secretaries, are all people that are appointed by the president. And the secretaries then are, of course, confirmed by the Senate. You find that this is also found in the legislative branch. In the Congress, you have, of course, the top staff people are also examples of political appointees. I was a political appointee in Harrisburg when I served as Director of Policy for the Senate, appointed by the President Pro Tem. Political appointees are people who are hired today and can be fired tomorrow. Yes, you need connections in order to be a political appointee, but you also have to have competence, or without high levels of competence, generally, you will not last very long. So you need connections and competence, but political appointees, that's the first public personnel system that you find in the at the federal service. At the federal level and at the state level. Secondly, we have the General Civil Service. The General Civil Service, these are employees who are white-collar employees. They're mostly non-professional. Remember how we defined professional and non-professional at the beginning of the semester. And these are non-professionals who have tenure in their organization. So the General Civil Service, these are individuals that are overseen by the Office of Personnel Management. They used to be overseen, of course, at the federal level. They used to be overseen by the Civil Service. Then we have career systems. Career systems are comprised of professionals who have tenure in an agency, but not in a specific position. The career systems that we're most familiar with would be found in the U.S. in the military, in the Foreign Service, in the CIA, and in the Public Health Service. These are individuals who go up through a progressive development, and they go up from one office to the next, to the next, to the next. They have planned progressive development in their field, planned progressive development, and they do have tenure in the agency. Okay, for example, in the military, in the Army, after one finishes one's training to be an officer, you would start out as what? You would start out as a lieutenant, then you go to a major, then you go to a colonel, and then you go to a general. That's planned progressive development. You also have something called generally selection out, and that if you are not progressing within a certain period of time, the agency, the service, will ask you to leave. That's the selection out. You find selection out became a hot topic in the U.S. Foreign Service back in the it was the late 70s, early 80s, I believe. There was a Foreign Service officer, I believe his name was Charles Lamb. He committed suicide because he was not promoted. In fact, he was selected out, I believe. And you know that old saw about how men's identity is wrapped up very tightly in their job. You find that he just couldn't deal with the loss of his position in the Foreign Service, so he committed suicide. But his wife joined the American Foreign Service Association. This is a professional association for Foreign Service officers. but it's not limited to Foreign Service officers. The family can join it as well. And so his wife was a member, and at the next election, she ran for the presidency of AFSA. Their headquarters are located right across Virginia Avenue from the State Department. And by golly, she won. And she won, and her major concern, or major topic that drove her to this victory was that she wanted to end selection out in the State Department, in the Foreign Service. And indeed, while she was president of AFSA, and for several years, the State Department did end selection out process in the Foreign Service. Since that time, it has returned. So we have the military, the Foreign Service, the CIA, and the Public Health Service. You find that generally when we compare these services, the CIA, we find that generally you're given far more responsibility at an earlier stage in your career than you are in the Foreign Service. Generally in the Foreign Service there is very slow development at the beginning, and it is you are in mid-career and later until you're given what you might consider to be meaningful and significant tasks. Well, we go on to the last type of public personnel system, and that would be the collective system. The collective system is primarily blue-collar workers, and their employment is governed by bargaining between unions or professional associations and the government entities that they work for. So collective systems. So these are the different types of public personnel systems that we find. Now, what are the traditional concerns of a person in personnel? If you are a personnel administrator, what are your major concerns? Well, number one is classification and compensation. You have to identify the duties, the responsibilities of each position in every organization. You have to group the positions according to their similarities, and you have to determine what's the appropriate compensation level. What pay should they have in accordance to the differences in the duties and responsibilities of the different levels. Another traditional concern, this is a term that I like very much, but we don't hear very much in administration. We've used it before when we were talking about POSDECORP, and that's staffing. Staffing consists of what? It consists of recruiting good people, selecting the right employees, evaluating your employees, and advancing or firing or discharging employees. And you're doing this on the basis of their relative ability, their skill, and their knowledge, right? The basis of their relative ability, skill, and knowledge. So traditional concerns in the personnel office: classification and compensation, 1. Staffing, 2. 3 is training. When we look at just the federal service, there's some interesting options for you when you get to be mid-career. When you get to be mid-career in the federal service, you can apply to be part of a program that allows you to go out and get your master's degree. We find that the federal government has chosen universities in each area of the country, one in the far west, one in the north, one in the north, one in the northeast, one in the south, and so forth. And employees, if they're chosen for this program, they go to that university, the government pays for their tuition and gives them a stipend for their room and board. And when you finish your master's degree, then you have to promise the federal government that you'll work for a number of years to repay them, that you'll stay with them. And the whole hope is that you'll be renewed, refreshed, and you'll come up to speed again on all the newest things that have occurred in your field. And in fact, my university, my graduate university, the University of Virginia, was the university that served as this training center in the South. So my public administration classes were very interesting. because about 1/3 of each class was filled with older individuals who had been serving many years, generally, well, I should say 10 to 15 years in Washington, D.C., or in one of the regional centers that are run by the federal government around the country. But in almost every class discussion, you would have those of us who were individuals who are fresh out of undergraduate school with our experiences and our opinions, and then someone in the back would raise their hand and say, well, that's not how it's done in the Department of Interior. Let me tell you the way that it happens in the real world. And then he'd tell you, give you anecdotes from the Department of the Interior, which added quite a bit to the class. So this is one mid-career program that the federal government runs. Another mid-career program that the federal government runs, again, is based in Charlottesville. It's the Federal Executive Institute, FEI. The federal government a number of years ago bought the Thomas Jefferson Hotel. It was a hotel complex on top of a hill overlooking what today is Barracks Road Shopping Center. It's just as you come from Washington, D.C., you're traveling south as you come into Charlottesville. It is on Route 29, and it is just before you get to the University of Virginia. But you'll see it on the right-hand side of the road, on the west side of Route 29, and there's a very nice gate there, and it says Federal Executive Institute, and that whole complex is laid out on the top of the hill. If you apply to go to FEI and you're chosen, you go away for a month. You're sent to FEI for a month, and when you arrive at FEI, you're assigned to your own room, and you're assigned to a team. They have team building exercises there, such as volleyball. They have a beautiful pool, and they have some of the world's most intelligent individuals there, some fantastic instructors in each and every field. For example, when I was finishing my PhD and I needed to defend it before my committee, we need a committee of 5, and we didn't have anyone on the faculty at UVA at that point that specialized in Canadian government. So they went to the Federal Executive Institute, and we found Don Echterlein, and he was willing to come up to the university and sit on my committee. So we had good representation all around, and I'm very grateful to this day for him. But FEI took a lot of our students and used them as interns there as well. But at any rate, if you are chosen for the Federal Executive Institute, you go to Charlottesville for a month, and you go to these special classes pretty much around the clock, and with reasonable breaks. And it's a nice way to recharge yourself as well as getting a little bit of a break. So those are the two ways that the federal government involves themselves with training, at least at mid-career. But a public personnel administrator would also have to be concerned with training someone when they first arrive. For example, when I hired someone in the Senate to work with the policy group, I would have them spend a week reading all the materials about the Senate and its organization and its history, so they knew who all the different officers were, what their responsibilities were, and so forth. And I'd have them spend the second week, even though they may have done this in graduate school, reviewing a whole host of materials about policy analysis, how to do it, and about some of the best new articles that were out there on the issues of the day that we were dealing with. So that's how we involve ourselves, that's how we approach training for new hires. The last traditional concern of public personnel administrators would be would be discipline and grievances. Discipline and grievances. Grievances, you need to provide channels that employees that believe they're not being treated fairly or justly can appeal through. For example, I would tell my employees that if they had any concern whatsoever to come to me. If I couldn't solve them, I would take them to the Senate administrator. And if the Senate administrator couldn't solve them, we go to the President Pro Tem. And if they couldn't be solved by the President Pro Tem, they weren't going to be solved. But that was a channel through which they could appeal if they had concerns about their employment in the majority caucus of the state Senate. So grievances is one area, and another area is discipline. What are the forms of discipline that you should have? Generally, you're looking at, for example, an oral reprimand that wouldn't be recorded, more like a friendly conversation among colleagues. You're not showing up at work on time. What's wrong? If that doesn't work, then you go to a oral reprimand, an official oral reprimand. From there, you would go to a written reprimand, and from there, you would have to be looking at suspension, demotion, reassignment, or dismissal. These are all the forms of discipline that are available to you, and I have to admit I dealt with situations both in the Senate and in Greene County at the Community Development Office with one of our drivers for low and moderate income individuals. One of our drivers seemed to be removing some of the money from the fare box, and we had to have a discussion with that person and approach that in the right way. And it was done. Well, what's the history of federal labor relations? We find that with the exception of postal workers and federal workers who worked in U.S. Navy yards, there was very little unionization that was present in the federal workforce, very little attempt to unionize at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. The first milestone that we can find in federal labor relations would be the Lloyd-La Follette Act of 1912. We find, of course, you have Senator La Follette, Representative Lloyd, and what the Lloyd-La Follette Act of 1912 did was it established the rights of employees to organize. So it said, you as federal employees may organize, but here's the other half. You could organize only if your managers gave you permission. So the Lloyd-La Follette Act said, yes, as federal employees you can organize, but only with the forbearance of your agency's management. Now, what was the basis, if you will, for the absence of unionization of workers and the absence of collective bargaining? It was the sovereignty doctrine. The sovereignty doctrine. And the sovereignty doctrine essentially said that if you left government workers join labor unions, and those unions would bargain for their wages and their benefits, that this was regarded as a loss of sovereign power. What is the sovereign power that establishes pay scales and benefits? Well, it's the legislature. So the legislature can't do all this, so they delegate that. Of course, they give that power to the executive, and the executive gives that power, from the president gives that power to the various secretaries, and the secretaries give it to deputy secretaries, and they give it to agency chiefs. So when you have collective bargaining in the federal service, and you have a union coming in, or a professional association with a bargaining agent, you find that who elected them? Well, the union might have, but they certainly aren't a representative of the general public. Who is looking out for the public's interests? That would be the bargainer on behalf of the bureaucracy with which they work. And in some instances, that bargaining agent might bargain very strongly on behalf of the general public. Sometimes, maybe not so much. At any rate, the 20th century is nothing more than a constant erosion of the sovereignty doctrine. We find through one statute or one precedent after the other, the sovereignty doctrine is slowly but surely eroding. The sovereignty doctrine is only reasserted twice in the 20th century. One, it's reasserted by the Eisenhower administration. It's asserted in 1955. In 1955, the Congress adopts Public Law 330. And Public Law 330 of the 1955 is still on the books today. It forbids federal employees from striking. So federal employees may not strike. Sovereignty doctrine was also reasserted by Ronald Reagan right after his election. I believe this action was taken in 1981. We find that up through the election of Ronald Reagan, the skies were becoming much more full with aircraft, particularly airliners. And we find that some of the airports, such as Kennedy, Dulles in Washington, LaGuardia, what's the one, Los Angeles and Chicago, particularly Chicago was the busiest airport for many, many years. You find that air traffic controllers there were at their breaking point. There was so much pressure, so much tension, and the volume of air traffic was so high that the air traffic controllers asked for pay increases and better working conditions, or they decided that they would strike. You find that this mess lands in Ronald Reagan's lap. Well, Reagan was saying willing to work with you. After all, he had been the president of the Screen Actors Guild for many, many years. But he warned the air traffic controllers and their bargaining agent, which was PATCO, Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization. It was based in Leesburg, Virginia. And we find that he told PATCO, if you strike, I have to fire you. Please do not strike. Well, at one point, they decided, indeed, they were going to move ahead and they were going to strike. So they struck, and the Reagan administration gave them 2 days to come back. About I guess it was close to half of the air traffic controllers did not come back. So the Reagan administration did indeed fire them. And we find that, how did they make up for that? Well, they made up for that by the air traffic controllers who remained on the job had to work even longer hours. And the Reagan administration brought military air traffic controllers in from all the military installations and put them in the civilian air traffic control towers for a number of years. They also opened up 2 new training centers for air traffic controllers. I believe they were in Georgia and Oklahoma, and they hired a whole new set of air traffic controllers. I remember seeing the ads and thinking, that salary is not so bad. But certainly the pressures of the job were quite great. But what did Ronald Reagan do by firing those air traffic controllers? He reasserted the sovereignty doctrine, didn't he? Now we find that President Clinton comes into office sometime afterwards, and essentially he decides that he's going to offer all those air traffic controllers who were fired by the Reagan administration, they all had an opportunity to return and be rehired by the FAA. And some did. So that was a relaxation of Reagan's reassertion of the sovereignty doctrine, wasn't it? And we again are on course for the erosion of the sovereignty doctrine. Well, as we look at the history of federal labor relations, I want you to be familiar with certain specific points. And we begin with President Kennedy. When President Kennedy was campaigning for the presidency, just as was true with Richard Nixon, they both believed that the federal service needed to take a good hard look at the laws that it worked under and its practices, and that some of them needed to be revised. And when President Kennedy won the election in 1960, he asked Arthur Goldberg to take a look, head up a group that would take a look at what should be done to reorganize the federal service. Well, eventually this results in President Kennedy issuing Executive Order 10988, and I'd like you to remember these three numbers. Executive Order 10988. And Executive Order 10988 required agency departmental management to deal with employee organizations and to grant them official recognition for negotiation or for consultation. I'm not going to go in that, but you could have your organization could have different statuses. And the greater status they had, in other words, the greater number of employees that were in your labor union within that organization, the more perks they had, if you will, in regard to negotiation. As I said, Richard Nixon agreed with Kennedy on the need for some reform in the federal service. So when he comes into the presidency, winning in 1968 and coming in January of 69, he issues Executive Order 11491. 11491. This simply updates and revises 10988. It updates and revises President Kennedy's executive order. This made federal employees' rights and privileges much more similar to the rights and privileges of private sector workers. It also established the Federal Service Impasse Panel to try to deal with negotiating deadlocks, and it allows the solving of disputes through arbitration. Of course, President Nixon has to resign in August of 1974 and is replaced by Jerry Ford, who had been the vice president, but before that he had been the minority leader for the Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives, of course from Michigan. Jerry Ford in 1975 issued Executive Order 11838. 11838. What did 11838 do? It was a very good executive order. It enlarged the scope of bargaining, that federal employees could bargain about other subjects, and it encouraged the consolidation of small bargaining units. For example, in the State Department at this time, the Secretary of State and his close administrators had to deal with a large number of unions. There was a union for telegraph operators. They would telegraph from the embassies back to the State Department. There was a union for secretaries. They had to deal with the American Foreign Service Association, representing the foreign service officers. They had to deal with a union representing the employees of the Agency for International Development. And they had to deal with the employees, with the union that represented the employees of the United States Information Agency. So you had 5 different unions that you had to deal with and negotiate with. What 11838 did is it allowed those to consolidate, and you find that all of them consolidated in the American Foreign Service Association, who soon became the bargaining agent for all those groups. Well, this leads eventually to President Carter, and under Jimmy Carter, we find that in 1978 we have the Civil Service Reform Act. And the Civil Service Reform Act is the first federal collective bargaining legislation enacted by Congress since Public Law 330 of 1955. So we have the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 being put on the books. And what did it do? It abolished the Civil Service Commission, and it replaced the Civil Service Commission with the Office of Personnel Management. Now that's where you go to be hired by the Federal Service, and by the Merit System Protection Board, the MSPB, which protects federal workers from political influence and from political pressure. Okay. What else did it do? Well, it brought advances in labor management relations that had all been recognized by the executive orders. Now, all this material that had been covered in executive orders was now found in statutory law, which has a higher precedence. So all of these advances which had been made under the executive orders were put into statute. And it also finally established the Federal Labor Relations Authority, FLRA. And this is an independent body that oversees all labor relations, labor management relations in the federal service. This takes us up to just a few things that still remain, and that would be when you find that, well, let's take a look, I guess, next at why public unionism emerged in such a major way in the 1960s and the 70s. Why did public unionism emerge among a group of people who were, I think in many instances, had meaningful jobs and were on the pathway to much better salaries and benefits? Well, first of all, public unionism emerged because there was legislation that passed that permitted it. Great example can be found in Canada. In the 1960s, there was a conservative government. There was a national election coming up. Everyone knew that conservatives were going to win, but the Liberal Party put up, they put up a platform which included the plank that all federal employees would be given the right to strike if they wanted it. Now, they didn't want it. They weren't seeking that. That was just something that the Liberal Party threw up as part of a platform in an election they didn't expect to win. Lo and behold, the Conservatives lost that election, the Liberals won, Lester Pearson becomes the new Prime Minister, and indeed the Liberals do go ahead and adopt that plank into statutory law. And all of a sudden, all of these federal servants in Canada who weren't looking for the right to strike had it. Now, what group of people were probably the least likely to organize or strike? It would be Foreign Service officers. But since there was legislation on the books that said you can do it, the Foreign Service officers of Canada, even though they had the Professional Association of Foreign Service Officers organization, they had PAFSO. PAFSO sought a change of status and went from strictly a professional association to also a labor union, and they became their bargaining agent. Again, the Foreign Service officers didn't seek this status, but it was given to them, and lo and behold, sure enough, there was shortly a national strike later. The postal workers in Canada struck during a long, hot summer. So the Prime Minister called out the military to deliver the mail. And the military didn't know where the addresses were, and they didn't know how to deal with rather aggressive dogs that might be scattered along the route. And the military couldn't wait to go back to base and have the regular postal employees deliver the mail. But that was Canada's experience with that. So the first reason why public unionism emerged is simply we had legislation that permitted it. Secondly, we had unions fighting each other for membership. Why do the unions want membership? The unions want members because the members bring with them dues, members' dues, and money. So what the unions would do is they try to outdo one another in militancy, and they encouraged employee unrest. And they did this so that they could try to show that they were more militant than the other group, so that employees would seek them to be their bargaining agent. One of the best examples of this could be seen in New York City. In the early 1960s, I remember this as I was growing up, there was going to be an election in New York City for the New York City teachers. That is the largest school district in the country, and they were going to have to decide who would represent them, the National Education Association or the American Federation of Teachers, which was a group put together by the AFL-CIO. Well, in these representation elections around the country, at that point, the NEA had won election after election. The teachers were choosing to stay with their professional association to represent them in labor negotiations. Well, at this time, we come to the New York elections, and the American Federation of Teachers simply is much more militant than the NEA. They said, well, you're underpaid, we'll get you better pay, we'll get you better benefits. And indeed, when the election was held, the AFT won their first representation election in a large district, and the whole nation was shaken by this particular election. I remember reading about it in the New York Daily News, for example. And lo and behold, there's another representation election in 1976. Now, 1976 is when New York essentially was bankrupt. They went to the state for help. The state said, we can't help you. They went to the federal government for help. And in one of the greatest headlines in American history, and you'll find it in the Ford Presidential Museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the state of New York, the city of New York approached the nation's, the Ford administration for help. And Jerry Ford says no. And so the headline on the front page, the whole front page of the New York Daily News, Ford to city, drop dead. But in fact, President Ford and the Ford administration forced the state of New York to go back and organize a task force to go to New York City, take charge of their finances, and to put them back in the black. You find one of the things that drove New York into bankruptcy was that they had a program where if you were a city resident and you finished high school and you were admitted to one of one of New York University or one of its branches, that they would pay for you to get an associate's degree. So they were offering to pay for college for you. This drove the city to bankruptcy, much as it did in California. At about the same time, California was offering the same kind of program to its residents, and again drove the state almost into bankruptcy. Well, in 1976, we find the city's bankrupt, but there's a representation election. The American Federation of Teachers is the bargaining agent for the teachers. They tell the teachers that the money isn't there, that the city has no money, we better be thankful for what we have. But what does the National Education Association do in 1976? They come back and they do what the AFT did to them in 1960. They promise the teachers better salaries, better benefits, that the AFT was selling them out. And this is just a great example of how unions tried to outdo one another in terms of militancy. And the NEA did that despite the fact that it was clear that the city was bankrupt. Well, the third reason why public unionism emerged, there was legislation that permitted it, unions fighting each other for membership, and thirdly, there simply was poor agency management in some situations and poor labor relations policies. Well, we find that when the two sides reach deadlocks in negotiations, we call this an impasse. What are the different procedures that we can follow when we encounter impasses in negotiations? Well, we have 4 impasse procedures that I want you to be aware of. One is mediation. Mediation is voluntary. The two sides can choose to participate or not. And it just helps the two sides talk, negotiate, and try to forge an agreement. You hear of mediation being used a lot in sports, in the world of sports, when players' associations are negotiating with their leagues, for example. In mediation, you have a mediator coming in if the two sides are willing to talk. The mediator goes back and forth between the two sides and says, well, this side feels this way. If you do this, we think that they'll do that. And they try to reach an agreement. The second impasse procedure is fact-finding. Here we find in fact-finding that you have a voluntary board or an individual will investigate and will make recommendations. Another name for fact-finding is non-binding arbitration. Non-binding arbitration, where the two sides can agree to this. A fact-finder comes in, checks out the claims and the demands on both sides, and tries to bring the two sides together. If they can't, you find that it is published, and the fact that it's going to be published, both sides are aware of that, and this fact that it will be made public plays a certain role in forcing agreements in many instances. The third impasse procedure is arbitration. And when there's arbitration, you have a panel of arbitrators or an arbitrator coming in. They listen to both sides, they study the issues, they issue a report, and the report is then binding. It's not like fact-finding where the report is voluntary. The two sides want to accept it. In arbitration, the report is binding and the two sides must accept it. Of course, the fourth and final impasse procedure is simply you go on a strike. You go on a strike. Well, lastly, to wrap up this section, we want to be sure that you know the arguments for collective bargaining in the public sector and the arguments against collective bargaining. Let's take a look at it for a moment at the arguments for collective bargaining. The arguments for collective bargaining are simply that with collective bargaining, you'll have better dialogue, and with better dialogue, hopefully you'll have better labor management relations. So the first argument for collective bargaining in the public service is there'll be better dialogue and better, hopefully, labor management relations. The second argument for collective bargaining is simply equity. You find that as early as 1955, the American Bar Association, in 1955, the American Bar Association asked, is it fair to deny federal workers the same rights and privileges that the federal government makes private employers give to their employees? So is it appropriate, is it right to deny federal employees the same rights and privileges that the government makes private employers give to their employees? So equity. Well, these are the two arguments for collective bargaining. What are the arguments against collective bargaining? The arguments against collective bargaining are fourfold. Number one is it violates government sovereignty. Here you have a under secretary or a deputy secretary negotiating on behalf of the people rather than the Congress. Is really a good representative of the people, for example. And who is he or she bargaining with? They're bargaining with union representatives. They're not accountable to the public. They weren't elected by the public. Here we have federal workers' compensation levels and benefits determined by unelected, unaccountable individuals. So it violates government sovereignty. Secondly, it interrupts essential services. Find that, of course, many public services are, for example, ambulance service, fire service, police protection. And you find, of course, there was a famous police strike in Boston when Calvin Coolidge was the governor of Massachusetts. Eventually, Calvin Coolidge brings in the National Guard, and they assume the policing duties in Boston. And he breaks the strike, and Calvin Coolidge then issues one of the most memorable quotes for human relations, if you will, in America, by saying, quote, There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anytime, anywhere. There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. That's a very memorable quote. There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. So the interruption of essential services is the second argument against collective bargaining in the public service. The third argument against collective bargaining in the public service is that it interferes with the budgetary process. It interferes with the budgetary process by leading to budgets that keep on getting higher and higher and higher. We never see a sequence of or a series of negotiating talks where the government salaries employees go down, do we? You find that increased public pay and increased public benefits sometimes will also benefit the public negotiators. You find it in many instances in school district negotiations. Maybe the business manager is negotiating on behalf of the school district, and a deal is struck, and you find that here the teachers' salaries increase significantly, and all of a sudden the business manager then can go to the administration and to the school district and say, aha, look, I'm the business manager of the school and I earn less than these senior level teachers do. Therefore, I need an increase in pay as well and an increase in benefits. And that happens from time to time. Also, to interfere with the budgetary process, you have something called the Hanslow effect. Hanslowe. Hanslowe. It's named after Kurt Hanslow, Kurt with a K, who taught at Cornell University. The Hanslow effect simply says that we have ever-increasing budgets through negotiations because you'll have mutual back-scratching that occurs between elected representatives and public employees. Let's take a look at, for example, Harrisburg. We find that in the state Senate, when I was there in the 1980s and the early 90s, there was a senator from Dauphin County. He was a wonderful man, a distinguished lawyer, really was responsible for getting a racetrack established in Grantville, John Shoemaker. And John Shoemaker then was elected as a state senator, and you find that he was the chairman of the state Law and Justice Committee. And the Law and Justice Committee was the only committee that would handle bills dealing with the privatization of the state stores. And you find that when that bill that Governor Thornburgh supported to privatize state stores in Pennsylvania, it passed the House, but when it came to the Senate, it would always come to Senator Shoemaker's committee. And Senator Shoemaker would look out in the political landscape, and who were his constituents? Well, he represented Dauphin County outside of Harrisburg, and you find many of his constituents were state employees, and he wasn't about to approve a bill that would take away some of their jobs or lower their benefits, and that would happen under a privatization of liquor stores. So he always blocked that legislation. It was a mutual back scratching. He stopped that legislation, and those constituents elected him and re-elected him and re-elected him. It's an example of the Hanslow effect. Finally, we find that the fourth argument against collective bargaining in the public sector is that collective bargaining is inconsistent with the merit system. Rouse believes otherwise, states otherwise. Rouse is wrong. You find that Frederick Mosier covers this in Democracy in the Public Service very clearly. In a collective system, who gets the raises when there's a raise available or promotion available? Who gets the promotion? It's the person with the most tenure. In a merit system, who should get that promotion? It's someone with the most skill and ability. So you find that collective bargaining simply is inconsistent with the merit system. And that wraps up our section on public personnel management. I'm going to come back in a little while, and we're going to talk about privatization. We're going to talk about privatization and look at one very interesting and illustrious example of that. I'll be back in a few minutes. Kimberly will be back in a few minutes. Thank you.